Welcome back to another episode of the Divine Ascent podcast. In this episode, we're going to be talking about the Indian church history, specifically the British era. And so if you haven't watched the previous parts, I highly recommend it to get the background information you need. Could you talk about the relationship between the Indian Orthodox Church and the Syriac Orthodox Church?
Sure. During this time, or particularly during this time of the Marthoma lines, right? This is, being 16, 17, going into the 18th century. The church helped us. The one after the Kunin Cross pledge, and the Syrian Church is the one of Antioch is the one that helps us. Our church is indebted and continues to be supported by the church, right? Particularly, not like they're sending clergymen and bishops to help support the church, right? And so and helping in apostolic church, and from perspective of how we're seeing it, like we said earlier, before them coming, we sent letters to all churches of who could support, right? Or at least that was our understanding, that they the Persian church, the Syriac church, the Coptic. It says even a letter to Alexander to the Coptic church, but it's the church in Antioch that supports, that comes, and then they steadily continued to, not on a regular, like a every year kind of basis, but there was bishops and clergymen coming, and so that our church is, you can say now, fully invested within the West Syriac tradition and the Church of Antioch from that point forward. Up until then, you can't say one way or the other. We know we're Syriac Christians because that, like we talked about in the very beginning, of the three liturgical languages of Christianity. Syriac tradition goes from Antioch to the east, all the way all the way to China. The Syriac tradition was the tradition that the Christian tradition that supported those communities, right? Because that was the missionaries are coming from from there, right? Or from that liturgical tradition, and so we are always invested in getting support from there. Because even when we think now, the church, as we'll talk about during this British period, already now Malayalam is now considered the main language of the churches, or the peoples, and present.
But they still practiced or conducted the liturgy in Syriac.
Syriac, because that predates even what we know as modern Malayalam. Before that, there's other Dravidian languages, and so but the Christians were worshiping in the Syriac language, in the Syriac tradition, and so that was the continuity, was the Syriac language, and that's where you see that a lot of the traditions, be it Latin, Greek, Coptic, or Syriac, that was from the very beginning. That was the liturgical language that kind of continued the apostolic traditions of the community, being tied back to one of the original languages where the church was growing, and they grew from the beginnings of the Christian church. And so that is our connection. The church in Malankara, the church in India, was being part of that Syriac tradition. So having the support of the church in Antioch was natural for us, because there were also another Syriac liturgical church, and they are the ones helping, right? And so then we are definitively with them, and they were, because they were supporting us, and they continue to support. So from that, you can say, for that point forward, we were with them, right? From and going forward, and so our relationship was one that we were that we were being part of their church, part of their church now, without doubt. Is we're being part of that. That they're in the West Syriac tradition specifically, no longer be it East or West, or something that's different, even different, just being in far away in India. Now we're fully following the same as them, same traditions as them, right, going forward. Because up until before that, you could say that it's fluid and different. Even Syriac tradition, the West Syriac tradition, there's different pockets of different monasteries and places that had different regional differences, and we can imagine the same thing in India. But once this modern terms of during the Marthoma line, now we're being more formally in line with the same as the church in Antioch, and so then that's our connection with them going forward. From there.
So then, how many Indian Orthodox bishops were there at a time in India?
So there was always one. So that, like, the Marthoma line, the church of Malankara was just one church, or one was a church as a whole, right? And there was one bishop, and so that we went from Marthoma one, and then when he's about to nearing his end, passing away, they'll select a successor. But because of that family history or the family lineage, it would usually go from the uncle to a nephew, someone from his same family, and he would ordain. But sometimes when there wasn't able to, if he passes away too early, or just to make sure to regularize it, and to make sure that there was a presence, at his there was a Syrian Orthodox bishop present. There would be different bishops present in from Syria or the Syriac Church in Kerala to also be present. So usually there was always at least one, the Marthoma bishop, the Malankara bishop, but also many times during this time to help make sure it was regularized and to be the community to accept. There was always a Syrian bishop also present. Because at a different time now, this time that we're having a steady influx of clergy, be it bishops and priests or Rambans, the monk priests, who are now living and residing or being present in the church in Malankara.
So then, can you tell us a little bit more about how the Protestant Reformation started in India?
So it comes in earnest with the becoming of the British, right? The British coming to India, and so with the British, once they have become a power in Europe, being an exploring power, a naval power, they're setting up so many of their bases in different countries now around the world. They set up the East India Company, and making that direct trade route of spices and all other resources of India to go back to Britain, and then supporting the British Kingdom, and then becomes part of it. Right? All the local kingdoms of India are now under the British rule, right? And so with them being a Christian nation, they also, just kind of like the Catholics when they brought their missionaries, their monks and the missionaries with them, with the Portuguese. The British have their missionaries, and they were known specifically as the CMS, the Church Missionary Society. And so, as a political and commercial things are being established by the British in India, same time now they also bring the religious the backgrounds or the religious foothold or their ideas to missionize in India. And so when they see other Christian communities, they were happy. They were supportive of Christian communities like them, and particularly, when they saw an ancient church that wasn't Catholic, because the Protestants were that's the Protestant Reformation happens in the 1600s. It was a protesting against Catholic tradition in the Catholic Church, right? Because of the misuses and when Martin Luther puts the 95 Theses of the bad practice of the Catholic Church, and then that continues out through Europe and different places and different ways, right? Different denominations come up. So when they come to India, they see an ancient church that also broke off from Catholic rule. They knew the history because it was just very recent when they come. They don't want to be part of the Catholic rule, and they see this also an ancient church, and they also know, like we talked about earlier, that St. Thomas community. They've heard of that tradition, and so they are very supportive of our church at the time when they come, and very supportive of nurturing and helping us to grow. So much so that they saw in the of our church at that time when they come, we have something called the Malpan system or the Guru system, right? In India, that's a very ancient kind of teaching system where you have a teacher and students, right? And that goes from during ancient times. And so in India, it's the Guru system, but the philosopher, the teacher, teaches the students. Within the Syriac tradition, it's known as the Malpan system. There's a Malpan, a priest who knows all the things of being a good priest of the church, and one who is very well trained and knows the traditions well will be appointed by the bishop to be the one to train other priests. And that's what we have. So then one priest would just get a cohort of students and teach them everything, from pastoral care, scriptures, liturgics, everything. But it needs to be a parish priest, and they go from there. But when the CMS come, by this time we already know also in Europe, the Enlightenment period, universities spring up, not just for secular education, but also for Christian education. That's where it begins. A lot of the Christian churches and monasteries are the ones that developed the universities in Europe. So they bring that same ideas of having a systematic seminary to train priests. And when these British missionaries of the Church Missionary Society come, they help the church say, hey, there's a better way of training more priests for your community to grow and to make sure that you have more faithful in your tradition, right? And so they were instrumental in helping us build our first seminary, which is known as Old Seminary colloquially, but it's known as the Orthodox Theological Seminary that was began and started, and to this day, that's still there today in Kottayam in Kerala. And so it is by their support we build our own seminary to train priests for our church.
When you say CMS, it kind of sounds similar to me, like CSI. Is there a relation between the CSI Church and the CMS?
Definitely. So, when we look at this CSI, the Church of South India, they're an Anglican communion type church, right? With the coming of the British, they also do missionary work and evangelize to the non-Christians, but also the Christian communities who were there, the St. Thomas Christians who were there, who are now accepting of the Protestant theology, come under this Anglican churches, right? Or they start Anglican churches in Kerala and Malankara. And so they start bringing churches. And so there was a formal like Anglican churches, like Church of England in Kerala. At the same time, they amongst later, and this comes out later, but coming from that root, they have churches who are use the kind of the Church of England or the Book of Common Prayer liturgical tradition, but based in India. So that, and particularly it's known as the CSI, the Church of South India, because there's two main parts, the of India, that there's the North and South. So they have the CSI, and there's also CNI, the Church of North India, right? But the Church of Malankara was the people of Malankara were in South India, and so the CSI Church grow out of the missionary activities of these CMS. At the same time, as well, because of their CMS influence, also we get the Marthoma Church as well.
So let's talk a little bit about the Marthoma Church. How did the Marthoma Church even start?
It's an interesting story. When you think about after the establishment of our seminary, we had very good relations, and it was started by Joseph Mar Dionysius II. He becomes a Malankara Metropolitan, and from that point forward, from that era, the head of the church, the Malankara Metropolitan, is residing at the seminary.
So what era was that?
So this is the 1815 is when it started. So this is the beginnings of the 19th century, the very early beginnings, right? So in 1815, with the help of the British CMS Society, they help us to build a community, a seminary community, and so when
this is when the Bariaram Seminary was established.
Par Seminary was established, right? So it's Joseph Mar Dionysius II. He's the founder. He's remembered to this day, and he had great support from the British, and they liked him, and he liked their support because he agreed to help make sure that we can grow the church and train have well-trained priests. He saw the benefit of having a systematic way, and so even the CMS missionaries helped teach scripture, theology, and those kind of things. But at the beginning, the CMS missionaries agreed not to teach Protestant theology. Their curriculum would be in line with the Malankara Metropolitans, the faith and traditions of the Malankara Church. So with the consent of the Malankara Metropolitan. They're agreeable to that. That's fine. We're not trying to change your church. We're trying to support, right? And so at the very beginning, it was very good relations. But after so many kind of years and decades, and when new professors and teachers from the CMS come to the seminary in Kortem, the Par Seminary in Kortem, they're now thinking, they see our Orthodox, the Syriac tradition churches, and the St. Thomas Christians, as being very Catholic still, even though they know that we're not under the Pope, but they see the intercessory saints, the remembrance of the departed, things like that are very Catholic leaning. So you should, and then there's from their perspective, the Protestant Church Reformation helped or form all those things to be better, right? To be more based on Scripture and more in line with what they saw as the better way of Christianity.
Did they not already know that the Syriac Orthodox Church or the Syrian liturgy itself already had those things?
Yes, and like I said at the beginning, they were just more supportive of seeing another church
that's non-Catholic.
That's not Catholic, and so you could imagine, as much as they believe faithfully in the Protestant theology, they were the first missionaries were just wanting to support. So much so that even up until this time we talked about, our church was worshiping in Syriac. So even the Bible is still in Syriac. So then preaching would be in Malayalam, but the priest would have to cite, translate, and teach, right? Because they know both Syriac and Malayalam by this time, because Malayalam now is a language, the common language in the churches in Malankara. And so,
but the people didn't know Syriac.
Yeah, people, they'd have the books, that would to worship. It'd be they might not necessarily know the Syriac letters, but it'd be in the Malayalam letters, but be the Syriac words, the Syriac singing for the congregation, but the majority was done by the clergy and the deacons and the altar, right? And the people came faithfully and doing the prayers as they were taught to memorize and the limited resource they had in writing. But by that time, still before the Europeans come, everything's handwritten. There's no printing press yet. But with the coming of the CMS and the support of this, Joseph Dionysius, when he's a Rambachan and another Ramban priest or monk priest, they translate the Syriac Bibles they have in Malankara amongst our community there, and translate into Malayalam. That's the first Malayalam translations, and the CMS were very much supportive of translating into vernacular wherever they went. When they're doing missionary work, they say we should have the Bible in the language of the people so that everyone has a Bible, right? And so as these Joseph Dionysius and our church are working to translate, the CMS had the printing press to make the Bible, print these Bibles so people have access to it, right? So they're very good with us. But after so many years, it's that that kind of changes. You can almost imagine the CMS missionaries are hoping, as seeing all the support that we're giving, they're saying that their theology might be better than what they're preaching. But then our church was very adamant. Majority of our faithful, the Malankara Metropolitan and the faithful were strong to keep up the St. Thomas tradition, right, of the Syriac, of the Syriac traditions of the St. Thomas Christians. But as these new missionaries are coming, the new teachers are coming, they're more openly saying, hey, you should be more in line with the Protestant theology, right? Break off a lot of these Catholic influences, right? Where they saw as Catholic practices and influences. And so with their preaching and openly teaching in the seminaries, Protestant theology, there are now some priests, like the professor, the Malpan priests, and a few faithful, and a handful of people agreeing with it. They say, yeah, they're right. Some of these things we're doing is very Catholic. We should be like these the CMS missionaries and be more Bible based, and we like our traditions because that's where our liturgy and our worship is from. But we can make some reforms. So the first reformer, like Malpan reformer, was a Malpan named Abraham Malpan, and he was one of the professors or teachers at the seminary. He was a Malpan, meaning he knew the Syriac language, and he was a Syriac teacher, meaning a Syriac Christian teacher, meaning of our tradition. But he agreed with the Protestant theology, so he slowly starts translating the worship, because the worship hasn't been made in Malay. It's just the Bible, so people can read on their own, and also for teaching, right? He's translated the liturgy, like the Qurbana service, from Syriac to Malayalam, but with reforms. Any reference to prayers, intercession to Saint Mary or other saints, taken out. In remembrance of the departed, taking out, to be more in line with Reformed or the Protestant theology.
Was he the first Malpan to ever translate from the Syriac text to
Yes.
the Malayalam text?
Okay. He's the first one to reform it and to change it too as well.
So he's both the first one to translate and reform.
To reform, because we can imagine Malpans before him knew both languages. And for teaching, I'm sure because they're teaching, they would teach also Malayalam. So there might be just their own handwritten notes of Malayalam, but they always worshipped in Syriac. That's always been the case. But the first one to worship in Malayalam, the liturgy, but also to make changes, not just to translate, exact, right? But to change, is this Abraham Malpan.
Are there any text of his translations from the Syriac to to Malayalam?
Yes, the Marthoma Church uses his translation, right? I'm sure they made edits from them, but they understand the beginnings of the Reformed Malankara Syrian, the St. Thomas Christian Reformed churches coming from this Abraham Malpan's, his translations. So it's from his translation that the Marthoma Church of today is worshiping. They're using the text based off his translations, and later, there later Malpans and Tirumenis and professors in the arts and professors, their whatever reforms they're needing, but begins with his.
So, did he even, I guess, celebrate the liturgy with his own reformation?
Yes. But now without controversy. He was in charge of the church in Marthoma. To this day, that's a stronghold Marthoma area, because that's where he began. So his church in Marthoma, that's where he was in charge of. He starts worshiping in Malayalam and using these the change text or this reform text, and the Malankara Metropolitan Mar Dionysius tells him to stop. He said, "You can't do this. You're changing the faith, right?"
Was he against the idea of the translation or against the idea of the
Both at this time, because they say that Syriac is what's maintaining the faith, right? Because now when they translate Malayalam, you've changed the faith too, right? So they're saying, hey, you have to be faithful to the tradition, which is the liturgical tradition of Syriac. So don't change that. We can preach and teach people in Malayalam, right? That's what we've always been doing. But they were still adamant still to this point, and keeping it Syriac. But slowly after this, they know that you have now people are needing Malayalam. Like you could see the benefit of it. But to make sure, but the biggest thing was to maintain the proper faith, right?
Yeah.
And so that's found only in the Syriac text. So he said, don't use his Malayalam translation. One, because it's going against, it's not what we've done before. But more importantly, it's changed. It's changed the meaning of the text as well too, right? And so they're very much against. And so that he's kind of excommunicated, or like he's suspended. He no longer because he's now teaching even the students. He's suspended by the Malankara Metropolitan.
So he's suspended but not excommunicated.
Well, the suspension means they said he's suspended. Like, hey, you no longer. They're hoping for him to change back, but he doesn't. Like he's suspended. He's no longer teaching, and he's told to stop doing celebrating in this Reform Day. So then, and so until he agrees to it, he's suspended, right? But later that becomes no longer, right? But that comes later because for this Abraham Alpine, also during this time, he's seeing the politics that's happening, as the CMS are no longer agreeing to just be neutral about what theology they're teaching. The Malankara Orthodox, the Mar Dionysius is telling, hey, our church is based on the traditions of the St. Thomas Christians of the Syriac liturgical tradition, right, of the St. Thomas Christians, and like I said earlier, from that time after Queen and Cross, it's now faithfully handed down by the West Syriac tradition, which is entrusted, by the Syriac Church in Antioch, right? So that our liturgical tradition is the same as theirs. We can't, we're not changing because we're maintaining our relations and our communion with them, and so we're not looking to change it because that's helping us maintain our tradition, right? Our apostolic tradition of being St. Thomas Christians in Malankara. And so we can't change it because that will go against from our forefathers before and go against what we know as the true faith, right? And particularly, he says, we won't even do it on our own. We have to, if there's any change in liturgy, it has to come from Antioch too as well. We can't just say we're changing it because then we have broken communion with them if we make a change without consulting with the Syriac Church. And so that's when the beginning you start saying that we won't do anything against what the Patriarch of Antioch also is upholding. And so the Abraham Milton understands that, everything, we are having Syrian bishops come to consecrate our metropolitans, Syrian bishops that are teaching and making sure that we're maintaining and understanding the Syriac liturgy, right? And so his plan is, how can he implement Reformed theology within our community? Because he also, as much as he likes Reformed theology, he still wants to be maintaining the St. Thomas tradition identity, which is Syriac, right? And so he has a nephew named Deacon Mathew, who is a deacon, like a seminarian who was a deacon. He sends him directly to the Patriarch with a fake letter, or with a letter saying that he has been chosen from the Malankara community, the Church of Malankara community, to be the next bishop. And he's the first.
And when we say next bishop, we mean next Malankara Metropolitan.
Because they're saying, hey, our Dionysius is getting old, and we need a successor. So then he sends his nephew with this letter, this forged letter, to say that he's been chosen. There was no meaning that chosen this Deacon Mathew, but when the Patriarch gets it, he doesn't know. Like I said, because there's no like internet telecommunications like today, right? You get letters that are signed and properly written, and the Abraham Malpan knows Syriac and knows how to properly write. He's a Malpan, a Syriac teacher of the church, and so he understands how to write it properly. So when it's received, it's seen as a valid letter. And so the Patriarch at the time starts now, and Patriarch of Antioch now goes.
But before we continue, you mean that the Deacon Mathew traveled from India to like Syria.
So he travels from Kerala, from the Malankara Church, all the way to the Patriarch, who is now residing in Syria, in Mardin, Syria. And so when he meets him, the Patriarch is overjoyed. Oh, first time one of the faithful of the Church of Malankara coming to him and to receive it. Because before he was just sending bishops to go to the Malankara Church, where he would get letters and asking, requesting. This is the first time coming. And so overjoyed. So this Deacon Mathew gets ordained from deacon to priest to Ramban to monk to bishop.
But didn't the patriarch instill the Syriac faith in him?
For sure. And so, like I said, it's already said he's already trained properly. And so, Deacon Matthew also knows what the plan is. It's not like he's just like unaware why his uncle is sending him. He also knows the plan. And so he makes sure that he does everything what's necessary to get ordained as bishop. And so, and says he learns Syriac and does a liturgy. And so he gets ordained as Matthew's Mar Athanasius by the Patriarch Elias. And then after residing there for a couple of months, or for some time, then he comes back to Kerala. And then when he comes back to the Kerala, to the Malankara Church, now he comes saying, I'm the new Malankara Metropolitan.
So how do the people like receive him? Like not the clergy, but like the lay people.
Everyone's confused, but they say, but you're not. It was like, no one sent you to go there. So who, like, what authority, right? But the problem is now is he has a letter of authority from the Patriarch himself, a Patriarch of Antioch, saying that he is validly ordained, and as the successor as Malankara Metropolitan. He's coming now to relieve Mar Dionysius and to step in that role. And so now the British, who are in control of the kind of, they're still the Rajas, the princes, the local princes and kings in India, but they follow what the British say, right? And so when he comes and he says he's validly ordained by the Patriarch, but also knowing that he's now looking to reform, he's accepted as the Malankara Metropolitan by the government itself too.
Oh, because he made it clear that he wanted to reform the church.
Oh, part one, he gets validly ordained. It's like he's the successor, and then Mar Dionysius at the time is getting old. And then, but also knowing that with the support of now Abraham Malpan, who's his uncle, and now getting some people, and knowing that he's kind of understanding that he's looking to reform the church, he gets acceptance from the British as well. And so now he's the validly or the legal authority for the Malankara Church as Matthew's Mar Athanasius. And so now there's this rift. There's those who are reformed, which is now growing in number. It's still a small number. It's not a large. With Abraham Malpan, his uncle, and of people who are now agreeing they like the Protestant Reformations, doing the liturgy in Malayalam, the vernacular of the people, and changing things. They're getting a following, right? And so then now, they take charge. And like I said earlier, the seminary in Corten was the seat of the Metropolitan by this time, with Mar Dionysius II going forward. And so he takes residence there. Now he's administering the church. And so now that those who are against him are now thinking, hey, what do we do? As they convene a meeting, and they say, hey, we need to change. And so they send a letter to the Patriarch saying, hey, this Mar Athanasius you sent is changing the tradition. That is no longer faithful to the Syriac tradition of the St. Thomas Christians, right? And so once he gets a letter, he goes, oh, okay. Send a letter back saying, hey, he's not validly the bishop because he's changed the faith. Part of his, the authority that's given to the faith, he's remained faithful to what our church traditions are. The moment he's changed it, he's not valid. But the problem is, they're saying now it's a foreign authority. It's like, you know what? The government's saying, no, he's valid. He came, you ordained him. We're not changing. He's the valid bishop. So then, so when the Patriarch sends that letter, it says he's not ordained. He sends a Syrian bishop, one of his bishops from Syria, to come to take charge with a letter saying that he's the Malankara Metropolitan in charge to administer the church.
Like a temp.
Or at least until things get properly resolved, he is in charge, right? But the government doesn't. The British government, the Indian government, who's under the British influence, the control, doesn't agree. Okay. They're not willing. They're saying, no, you're not. Matthew's Mar Athanasius is the one in charge.
So even after the Syriac bishop came to like India they still wouldn't.
They still, with a letter from the patriarch, they said no. Matthew's Mar Athanasius is he's the one in charge, and so then it comes the patriarch himself has to come. So and then this time now it's Patriarch Peter III,
So this is the patriarch after.
the one who ordained Mar Athanasius, because he's already passed away. So but now the next patriarch, he makes the journey, and he's the first patriarch of Antioch to travel from Syria to India.
So then, what does legal authority mean, and does he still have spiritual authority?
So the biggest thing is legal authority means who is in charge of worshiping in churches, and then, like I said earlier, when the seminary is established in 1815, that becomes the headquarters for the Malankara Metropolitan. That's where his seat is, right? And so that's the seat of power for the church, right? In terms of like authority, not power, the seat of authority. So whoever is residing there is seen as the one in charge, right? And so the legal authority means that he has all rights to be there. He has all rights to enter churches. And so the biggest thing is the people who don't like his reform, the reforms that he and his uncle Abraham Malpan are doing, they can't legally stop him from entering churches to start doing these changed services because the government is saying he's allowed, right? And so, so with a legal authority, it starts in 1843 when he comes as Mathew Mar Athanasius from Syria, and so for almost a 30 plus year period, he has this legal authority. And so the biggest thing the government says is he's validly ordained by the Patriarch of Antioch, which is the Church of Malankara says that's the tradition that they're from, and they're like we said earlier about our church's relationship that we're in from the time after the Queen and Cross, explicitly now we're in the same church. We're the same church with the Syriac Church of Antioch. He's validly ordained. He has all the right. He has the letter from the Patriarch. All the thing makes him valid in their eyes. There's no way you shouldn't just change it because you don't like him, right? And so they continue to support him. But the community understood that it's not just about having the technicality of being ordained by him, by the Patriarch, and having these letters. You have to maintain the faith, right? And so there's this divide with the government giving him the legal authority, but the people majority of the people not supporting him. But because of over these 30 years that he has the legal authority, they start growing in numbers, right? Still smaller compared to the others, the Orthodox side, but they're still growing. And so because of the people's complaints, we said, we would send letters like before, sends letters. The Patriarch sends a bishop, and Mark Kurilos, he comes to investigate to see what's going on because I sent this Mar Athanasius, and if he's changing things, he has the authority to put things back to where it is.
So Mark Kurilos is sent with the authority of the Patriarch
to find out what's going on and to make the changes. But the problem is, the government doesn't give any legal authority to make any change. There's Athanasius is the legal authority.
What about spiritual authority?
He's bishop, but like I said, the biggest thing is, they never said that they're not bishop. They said you have no legal authority to change things, right? So that means because the biggest thing is the seat where the properties where that shows the authority is coming from, but at the same time also, which we didn't mention earlier, but the biggest thing is also once the British come, to run the church, you need money, right? And so the one who has access to the accounts, particularly there was a trust fund that was set up with monies that was given by the government, particularly one of the local kings supported the church and giving land, and then the also money that from the community was deposited to be a support for the church, right? So who has a legal authority of administering and using those funds and using those properties is Mar Athanasius.
Did Abraham Malpan still have an impact?
Yes, because he's supporting his nephew, and he's and continuing to make translations and continuing to bring people to that reformed theology, right?
So
until he passes, right?
So I guess by Mar Athanasius, he was unsuspended and back into the church.
It's not that he was unsuspended. It's who has the sway of the people and who has the sway of the government, right? Mathew Mar Athanasius had the authority of the government. So and then also and slowly trying to build up sway of the people. But still, the majority of people are not accepting his changes. But people are trying to resolve things, and then the Patriarch is sending. So when Mark Kurilos was not able to, the patriarch sends another bishop, and his name is Mar Athanasius Stephen. This time to come because now Mar Dionysius the Fourth is getting old age, and he's willing to step down to get resolve this issue. So this Mar Athanasius Stephen comes with authority to be the successor to resolve all these things, right? With the authority of the patriarch, but he too also is not given any kind of legal authority by the government, the British government, and so he also goes with not going to do anything. He's a bishop, spiritual, able to do liturgies, as he knows how to do it, but he has no legal authority. So then that doesn't resolve the situation, if that makes sense. And so, because the biggest thing now is who has the legal authority. And so now the side that wanting to remain Orthodox is, you know what? This all began because Mar Athanasius was sent as a deacon to Syria and got valued. And that was the biggest thing. The government kept saying that he went and got actual adoration from the patriarch and came back. That was a big deal. So then said, hey, you know what? Why don't we do the same? Our community, they get together and send Polycultural Joseph, who was a priest of the church, and a Malpan, he's teaching the seminary, but of the Orthodox side. And they say, we're selecting him to be the next Malankara Metropolitan, to take over, to succeed Mar Dionysius the Fourth. And so he travels to Syria with the valid letter from the community to be ordained as the next and consecrated as the next Malankara Metropolitan. The patriarch at the time receives him. This is this patriarch Peter III receives him, ordains him, and sends him back. But and he comes back as Joseph Mar Dionysius the Fifth. But he has the same problem. When he gets there, the British government is saying, no, there was no legal authority to depose Mar Athanasius, so you're not the next Malankara Metropolitan. So he's still, even one of our own who go get ordained by the patriarch by this time, he still is not being accepted. This was in 1865. Mm-hmm. And so then, they say, you know what, we're going to have to bring the patriarch. He needs to come to resolve it, because that's what seems to be the only way. And so at that time then, Patriarch Peter III makes the journey in 1876 to come to the Church of Malankara. And he convenes a synod and a Mulantarthi. There's a St. Thomas, that's still the church is there to the Mulantarthi, St. Thomas Church. And at that synod, he formalizes the faith of the church and the administration to be who's valid and who's not, right? Mm-hmm. And what's the authority, the community, how their voice is to be heard. So this is the first time. Before, there's always a convening of the representative of the churches, but now the formalization of this Malankara Syrian Christian Association. That's the Congress, you can kind of say, of the church, and making decisions and accepting of the faith and professing the true faith. He holds a synod, and it says that the reforms are invalid, and the teachings of Mar Athanasius are not correct. Joseph Mar Dionysius the Fifth is the valid Malankara Metropolitan, upholding the faith of the church, and then they make other decisions. But the other big decision that would happen at this synod is now that for the longest time there was always one bishop in charge. Mm-hmm. But at this juncture now, because of this issue with the Reformed ideas coming into the Malankara Church, the Reformed Christian ideas coming to Malankara Church, the patriarch also makes the decision to divide the Malankara Church into 7 dioceses. So now there's the Malankara Metropolitan with 6 other bishops. So he ordained 6 others, and one of those, the bishop that ordained at the time is Padre Margaret, as we know today. It's the saint of our church. He gets ordained at that time, which we can go to later. But the biggest thing is, this is the first time now we start seeing more authority of the Patriarch of Antioch being exerted in the Church of Malankara. Up until this point, they were supporting and always just one bishop in charge, and we had very good autonomy, right? Mm-hmm. But always, deferring and getting support from the church and the Patriarch of Antioch and the church of the Syriac Church of Antioch. But once he comes in to convene this synod to resolve this issue about the Protestant ideas being, coming into the Church of Malankara, he also makes his own kind of changes to exert more authority, right? And so now it's no longer just one bishop; he's one among 7, right? So kind of dilutes the authority of Malankara because now he has 6 others with him, and they're all supportive of the Patriarch of Antioch.
And this is Dionysius V with 6 others, including Gregorius the Remini,
Yeah,
or
Paramatirmini,
Saint Gregorius,
yeah.
and also, isn't it Saint Dionysius among the 6?
No,
No.
not
Okay.
yet, not yet. He comes later.
Okay.
Vatrisa Martin Dionysius comes later. He's a disciple of Paramatirmini.
Okay.
But he comes later. It comes some decade, little bit later. Not so much, not too far later, but he comes later. At this time, he's like, I think he's barely just born around this time when this happens, or like a very young at this time. But then he gets trained under Paramatirmini, and then he goes also when there's he gets selected later to be the Malankara Metropolitan, goes to the Patriarch, and then from there that we start. We'll talk about later. He's instrumental in establishing an autonomous and autocephalous church in the Malankara Church, no longer needing to keep going back to Syria, but having now all authority in India itself to govern the church.
So then let's talk about Mar Athanasius and the Abraham Malpan. What happens to them after the synod?
So the biggest thing is, they're now they don't. So by this time, I think Abraham Malpan is no longer, like he's old and not having exerting much authority, But his ideas continue on, right? Like what he passed along keeps going. But Mar Athanasius now is, now he's officially deposed, right? Or is no longer having legal authority. Now with the Patriarch coming, the government can't say, he's valid, because the Patriarch himself comes and says he's not valid anymore, right? And so Joseph Mar Dionysius the fifth, Dionysius the Fifth, is now has the authority. But now there's this new Malankara Syrian Christian Association, because now there's 7 dioceses now, and how that governs. So now they work all that out. But also this Patriarch Peter III, now, like I said, exerting authority, make sure he gets a letter of an allegiance to him, to hold more authority. Like, now they're saying they're to him, right?
To the Patriarch.
To the Patriarch. So that's when we start seeing now. We start seeing more signs of, because always, anytime a bishop is ordained, you're showing allegiance to the church that ordained you, right? But in a sense of like, hey, we're accepting that what he's providing is coming because he has the authority of upholding the traditions of the church. And so when we're saying that owing allegiance, is saying not so much to the person, but to the authority keeping that apostolic Christian faith, right? And so the Church of Malankara always understood that being an apostolic church coming from the missionary activity of St. Thomas, and being a sister church to other churches that, like the church in Antioch, the authority is Patriarch and the Antioch Church has definitely helped us, and we understood that they were always supporting us in the time of need. But the loyalty was always to the faith, first and foremost, and the people responsible for upholding the faith. And so we're never to deny that. But now we see a little bit change. It's not so much now just the faith, it's to him directly, right? To the person of the Patriarch, not his authority as holding it. They go hand in hand, but you can start seeing now it's now becoming more about owing allegiance to him, right? No matter what, right? And some people can say both ways, because to make sure that the people don't go off to Reformed ideas like Matthew's Mar Athanasius did. If you make sure you uphold allegiance to him, you shouldn't have that worry, unless if the Patriarch himself changes to Reformed ideas, right? And so that's the safeguard in one sense. But we start seeing from that point forward, the Malankara Church now having to deal with that, that reality of now, hey, now we're saying directly, there's no other kind of room for autonomy. It's directly under him, right?
So it's now whatever your grace believes in condemns, I believe and condemn.
Yeah, which, like I said, that's at every ordination. That's accepted because it's about in all Orthodox traditions. When we talk about the role of the bishop, one of the biggest roles of him being as bishop, and why they're respected, is not them as individual persons. They're being entrusted of upholding the faith. So when they're consecrated, they're saying that they're upholding the faith of Jesus Christ handed down by the apostles, and they will faithfully hand that down to their successors and to people who, and the faithful below, right? They will not deviate from that faith as handed down by the church, right? The liturgical traditions, the scriptures, the faith and practices, the sacraments, all those things. The person, the bishop, from the very beginning, from the early church, that is his role. That's why that they have such a high standing in the church, because in them, they're responsible for upholding it. The people all accepting him and following through, we have a relationship to make sure that's being happening. Because if the people see that the bishop is going away, they can call him out. That's what happened with Matthew's Mar Athanasius. They understood that he was not upholding the proper Christian, the apostolic faith that was handed down. So they were sending pushing back at him. But the problem was he had the legal authority, right? And so there's always this, the perspective of how you maintain that, right? And so, but when Patriarch Pio III comes and convenes this synod in Malankara, he now exerts more, more like from this point forward. Now it's more about to him, and all successive patriarchs after him are now continuing making sure, right? And so then that's when you get later in the history of our Malankara Church, we start having different groups of Orthodox group factions within the Malankara Church.
And
And that
so,
begins here with this division with our division with the Marthoma Church.
this is where the Marthoma Church separates from the Orthodox Church,
Right,
and
and they
starts.
become the Marthoma Church.
Is still Mar Athanasius at this time leading the Marthoma Church?
Yes, and then he has his successors, because by this time it's already been 30 plus years. I forget the year that he passes away, but then they do successive bishops.
This is like 1875,
Yeah,
right?
and then goes into the 1870s and go to the 1890s when the final resolutions of all this, the Malankara Synod, 1876, sorry, and then leading forward, right? And so then it takes time, but then by this time, Mar Athanasius is deposed or removed. The Orthodox Malankara Metropolitan is now accepted and has all the legal authority, and then the Marthoma Church from that point forward, from that 1870s and going forward, are now separate completely. So then they have to start their own churches, right? Other than, I think there's two churches that I can't remember the places right now. I think one in Schengen or one other place. We share a church, Marthoma and Orthodox, because it's a historical church for the communities there that we share. But all the remaining all churches, the people who went with the Reformed ideals, started separate churches in all other places. They didn't. They had no more legal authority to be in the traditional, the older churches, the Orthodox churches.
Did the British still have influence in Old Seminary?
By this time, it began to wane, right? They still had influence in terms, because they were still, the British don't leave India until the 1940s, right?
Yeah.
So they still had influence, but after seeing all this, fight with us in the Marthoma Church, they naturally started supporting Marthoma side, and more working with them, because now they are in alignment with the Reformed theology, right? And they also are building up there's Anglican churches they set up in Malankara and in the present day Kerala, and then also the CSI Church, like we said earlier, are also now being developed, right? And they're supporting of those churches, and they kind of leave the St. Thomas Syrian Christians alone. They no longer actively try to influence the theology.
Was there still Protestant theology being taught at that seminary still?
No, from that point forward, no. Now
it went back to Orthodox.
Yeah.
Okay.
Because they were still even though Mar Athanasius was there, there were still our Malpans and our priests still there. It just disagreeing with, they're both are being taught. Our side is saying there shouldn't be any Reformed theology other than comparing maybe, but not being taught as the faith, right? And so once after this 1876 and the synod and the removal of Mar Athanasius, then that completely is removed from the seminary for as an active, right? I'm sure there's people who kind of maybe had a agreement or kind of liked it, maybe still. I don't the details of that, but for the most part, they all went and went with the Marthoma Church as it formed from there, and then those who remained faithful to the Orthodox position remained at the original seminary in Cortam.
So we know about the Marthoma Church line and how they originated. Let's take a step back and talk about the Malabar Independent Syrian Church.
Okay.
Where did that begin, and how do they help us?
So the Malabar Independent Syrian Church has a very interesting history, because they're part of the same time as Christians. They're a Syriac liturgical church, just like us. They use the same service, the West Syriac tradition, just like us. The beginnings is interesting. When our church, with the Marthoma lines coming, when we get to Marthoma the sixth, to make sure his consecration is regular, and bishop from Syria comes, even though he's already selected and chosen by his the bishop before him, Marthoma the fifth. But then when the Mar Gregorios comes, and he comes with him also another bishop, Ivanios. Mar Gregorios consecrates him as the Malankara Metropolitan, but with the title of Mar Dionysius the First. So at that time, this Mar Dionysius the First, who is the sixth Marthoma of the Malankara Metropolitans of that line, he has his time as the Metropolitan. But the interesting part is when this Mar Gregorios, who remained in India this whole time, from the time he came to help consecrate Dionysius the First, he lives and he remains the rest of his life. He remains in India, and so near the end of his life, he had a Ramban, a monk priest, a Korean Ramban, a Rambachan, who stayed and helped take care of him. But this Mar Gregorios was not happy that the Mar Dionysius, as the Malankara Metropolitan, didn't give him proper care, like properly look after him, make sure that he was okay or properly cared for. And so it says that he quietly ordains or consecrates this Korean Ramban as a metropolitan without anyone knowing, right?
And this Ramban was the person taking care of him.
And he's taking care of it. And so the people, the Dionysius first is like, how can you ordain? We didn't ask for another one, and we don't, it was done, and you just kind of ordain him or consecrate him. But they trusted, he believed, he consecrated him and with all the proper ways, because just like Mar Gregorios consecrated him as Dionysius the First, so they didn't deny or doubt that he did a service for him. But it was like wasn't at the request of the community. There wasn't a need at the time, right? And so, but at first, being a validly, seen as a validly ordained or consecrated bishop, he kind of is there, but he doesn't have the support of the community. But the government's like, okay, he's got ordained just like Dionysius the First. This Mar Gregorios did it, so he's a bishop. But lowly, because they're seeing the division, the local Raja, says, this is causing too much problem. You don't have, don't practice here. You shouldn't worship here with this community because you're causing problem. For the most, that's the sense. So then he goes to a place where that's outside the influence or the presence of our Malankara community, the church community. So this is now, at that time, was British Malabar. So in the Malabar region of Kerala at that time, there wasn't much of our church as a presence. It's being administered by the British who were there at the time. And so this Korean Ramban, who's given the title as Mar Kurilos, he just kind of does his own thing there in this Malabar region of Kerala, known as in a place called Thorir. That's what they're also a name for their church. And so later successors come after, and then with all the different things that happen in our church, that's happening in the Malankara church, we have Dionysius the First, second, third, fourth. There's the decline of the Marthoma lines. After Dionysius the First, the Marthoma lines coming from the archdeacons, who coming from the same family, becoming uncle, nephew, or uncle to one of their family members, starts to decline. So then, when Dionysius the First passes away, he from their family he makes Marthoma the seventh, and then to be the successor, right? Sometime before he passes away, but after Dionysius the First passes away, this Marthoma the seventh was very sick, or wasn't a healthy person by that time. It says he dies within a year, and so now there becomes vacant, right? There's this gap, but it says that before he died, another one of their family he lays hands and says he makes him as Marthoma the eighth. That causes an issue because the people are like, how can you? He was about dead. They knew he died. He quickly declined. His health declined, and so it was seen that it wasn't a valid consecration because it was near his deathbed, and it says that there was no liturgy. There wasn't done it within a qurbana or liturgical service. So he just laid his hands on him. That was it, and so people weren't accepting of him. And also they were like, by that time now the community was not necessarily so keen on always having it from that same family, and so there's a good number of monk priests there, and so they selected one of the Rambans, Joseph Ramban, to be the successor, and that's becomes Dionysius the Second. And so now there's rivals. There's the Dionysius the Eighth, who doesn't have the support, and they questioned his consecration as a bishop. And then there's elected a person who's supported by the community, and so but he needs to be ordained. So because Marthoma the Eighth is not going to do it, and so uh, they call upon the bishop residing in the Malabar independent area, and so but it's not Marquidlos now; it's his successor Mar Felixinos. He comes and consecrates because they're still, other than not being chosen at that time, their church, the bishops from the Malabar church were seen as valid because they had valid ordination from a bishop of the Syrian tradition, right? And so they did question that he was also ordained or consecrated by his bishop, and then he became the one in charge, and so he comes, leads the church and consecrates uh, Mar Dionysius II. And so, and it says, and then it goes on then Mar Dionysius is in charge. And then another time it happens when Dionysius, one of our Metropolitan would pass away, then again, the Mar Felixinos need to come to be in charge of the Malankara Church and leads as Malankara Metropolitan until they select another a successor, and then he consecrates that one. And so our church has just like we are thankful to the church in Antioch, and we're supportive because being part of the church. We're also thankful for the Malabar Independent Syrian Church because of their support and helping us during those times, right? During that time of transition that's happening, because this is all happening when the British are coming. This issue with the Marthoma Church, as we talked about earlier, we need the continuity of the faith, of having the bishops to uphold the St. Thomas Christian community of the Syriac, upholding that Syriac faith of the community. They were there, right? Even though it didn't happen the way that the people thought or planned, but the need came for them to be supporting the church, and so they were supportive of our church. To this day now, they're independent. We're not in communion or relation because though we follow the same liturgical tradition, their churches are running separately, right? And so they also have relations or communion with the different denominations of the Church in Kerala, be it particularly more with the Protestant churches like the Marthomas or the CSIs. And so we're not in communion with the Malabar Independent Church, but we're very grateful for their presence and then supporting our church during that time of need.
So we were still in communion back then, and we know for sure that they practiced the same liturgical rite.
Right. Even to this day, they still practice the West Syriac tradition. The only thing is, we say but they're in communion with, churches that are Syrian tradition, but aren't as they're not Orthodox. They're willing to be with the Protestant Reformed churches that they have relations and communions with them, right? Or understandings of theological understandings and communion understandings with them, and so that our churches aren't together. Like it's not just like a separate faction. It's just they're seen as independent from us.
So we know that Mar Felixinos is a descendant of Kyrillos Tirumeni, right? And so we know that Mar Felixinos consecrated 2 bishops at this time. When were those ordinations?
Okay, actually, to
Or
clarify,
consecrations?
he consecrated the next 3, like the second Dionysius the second, third, and fourth, and he even led the church. So the first one, the Mar Dionysius the second, when he's selected to be the successor to the Malankara Metropolitan, that's in 1815, and that's Dionysius the second. If you remember, is the one who established the seminary in Cortam, our Cortam Prayer Seminary, or the Orthodox Theological Seminary, and so that's in 1815. And so it's interesting. So like I said, in our church is indebted to the Malabar Independent Church because they helped consecrate Mar Dionysius II, and Mar Felixinos is the 4th bishop of the 3. The independent church, because this is about a 50-year gap from Mar Kyrillos to this now Mar Felixinos is about a 50-year gap, and so it says he's the 4th descendant, of the line of this Malabar Independent Church. So in 1815, and then Mar Dionysius is there only for about two years as the Malankara Metropolitan. He passes away without successor, and so then Mar Felixinos is called to head the Malankara Church. So he's the Malankara Metropolitan for about a year, from about 1816 to 1817. He's there until the church can get together and select a new metropolitan. And so it says Mar Dionysius III, or Punothera Mar Dionysius III, is selected, and Mar Filixinos consecrates him as the next Malankara metropolitan. And so then he goes back, right? He doesn't try to remain as Malankara metropolitan. He didn't fight for that. And once they picked a successor, he helps consecrate the next one. And the same thing happened when Dionysius III. He doesn't get to consecrate his successor, and so again, the Mar Filixinos comes, and this is in 1825, or the 1820s, and then this time he doesn't have to be the Malankara metropolitan. They've selected the community selects Chaput Mar Dionysius the fourth, and he's consecrated by Mar Filixinos. So those during the beginnings of the 19th century, so from the 1800s, from the very beginnings, from 15 to 25, in that 10-year period, they were called to support, to help lead the Malankara Church, right? During this time of transition. And so this is the time where we started the beginning of the seminary and the CMS missionaries coming. And so it helped for the continuity of our church to remain faithful to the Syrian Christian community in Kerala, St. Thomas Christians, because without them, because at this time the biggest difference was just being separated by who's the Malankara metropolitan. But in all other aspects, the Malabar independent church was just the same as us, right? That's why the community willingly accepted him to help consecrate and lead when the time needed. But then we're grateful that they always went back, right? So they're still here. They're still active to this day. They're a very small church still. We're not in communion with them now because of different, after so many years of being separate and different decisions their church has made in ecumenical relations. We're not in full communion with them, but they're a sister. They're another Christian community within of the St. Thomas tradition in Kerala that we recognize.
But we were in communion with them from between like the 1815
From the beginnings,
1825.
and those times for a long time. It's more until recently, when we start seeing them being in communion with other Protestant churches, that we're no longer like in full kind of. We know we're always divided. They've been separate from us since that time, but always kind of a understanding between the two churches. But over some centuries, decades, and centuries now, we're not in full communion. We recognize each other as sister churches, as Christian churches of the St. Thomas tradition. Just like the Syriac Malabar or Marthoma Church, they're just one amongst them now.
So then, how do we know that our consecrations by Mar Filixinos is still valid?
Because we accepted, when Marcos was consecrated, no one doubted that him being a bishop. The biggest thing was he wasn't selected to be a successor for Mar Dionysius I, so he wasn't accepted by the community. It was just Margarius, because of him being upset by not being cared for. He just kind of on his own made the decision to consecrate him. So that's why he was never accepted as a bishop in charge. He was accepted as a clergy because he was a Ramban and took care, and he was consecrated as a bishop by Margarius, who also he was the one that helped consecrate Mar Dionysius I, right? And so no one wanted called into question his ability to consecrate. It is a matter of, but to lead the community he wasn't accepted. So then they continued just having successors, like our church would do as well. And so their faithfulness to the Syrian tradition wasn't called into question, particularly during this time, because that was the only tradition other than Catholics. It was just the St. Thomas Syrian Christians, who were there. So they were seen as one amongst us, even though separate, like kind of like a family, kind of like the outside, but still family, but not disagreement kind of keeps separation. That's how that kind of relationship was during that time.
So, well, that was the last question to this third part of the episode. So first, I would like to thank you for coming on, talking to us about the British era. And before we end, could you end us off with prayer?
Sure. Body, Christ, our God, as we come to you on this day and this evening to continue to praise your name and to be able to continue to study about the history of our church, of our Malankara Church, of the St. Thomas Christians of India. We're always grateful grateful for the missionary work and the apostolic traditions that were brought to us by St. Thomas, your apostle, who followed your holy will and your calling for him to preach the gospel and bring the light of your gospel to our forefathers and mothers in India. We continue to pray that you help us to be faithful to your church, be faithful to the traditions of upholding the faith of the church that you established through your apostles, and that you help us to continue to spread your word to our churches, to our church family, to our communities, and to all places, and rejoicing in the faith that has been given to us, that our faith in you as our Lord and our Savior, that you died and resurrected for our salvation, that you bring us everlasting life through your Spirit, and you continue to support us and providing your grace so that we can continually be raised up before your presence. We pray for all those who have asked us to pray for them, the sick and the suffering, those who are without, those who are dealing with all kinds of hard trials and tribulations, experiencing struggles and wars and famines and the evilness that we commit as men. Help us as a church to continue to be a lighthouse of faith as your apostles brought your light to lighten our darkness, so that your peace, love, and your grace reign in our hearts and in our communities, so that we can reflect your holy kingdom, your heavenly kingdom in all places. We ask this all in the name of the Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit, both now and always, and forever and ever. Amen.